When a desperate mother prays for her captured son, the last thing she expects is compassion from her captors. But in a moment that will change both lives forever. One Sioux chief must choose between tradition and mercy. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. In the vast expanse of the Dakota Territory, 1868, the golden rays of the setting sun painted the rolling plains in hues of amber and gold. Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old widow, stood at the door of her modest cabin, her weathered hands clutching a worn shawl around her shoulders as the cool evening breeze swept across the prairie. Her eyes, blue as the summer sky, scanned the horizon anxiously for any sign of her 12-year-old son, William. "William!" She called out, her voice carrying across the open land. Supper's nearly ready. The Thompson homestead sat isolated on the frontier, miles from the nearest settlement. Sarah and William had moved west 2 years prior, following the death of her husband, James, who had succumbed to pneumonia during a harsh winter back east. The promise of free land under the Homestead Act had drawn them to this remote corner of the Dakota Territory, where they hoped to build a new life. Inside the cabin, a pot of rabbit stew simmered over the fire, filling the small space with its savory aroma. Sarah returned to her cooking, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, while casting worried glances toward the window. William had gone to check their small trap line at the edge of the creek that afternoon, and should have returned by now. "That boy," she muttered to herself, a mixture of concern and exasperation in her voice, always losing track of time. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Sarah's worry deepened. She extinguished the cooking fire and grabbed her husband's old rifle from its place above the door. Though she had learned to shoot out of necessity, the weight of the weapon still felt foreign in her hands. Stepping outside, she noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon, promising a storm before morning. "William," she called again, louder this time, her voice tinged with growing fear. The wind carried back no reply, only the rustling of the tall prairie grass and the distant howl of a coyote. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she made her decision. She would follow the path to the creek where William had set his traps. Perhaps he had fallen and injured himself, or become lost on the way home. The fading daylight cast long shadows across the land as Sarah made her way toward the creek. She moved as quickly as she dared, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of her son's passage. The tall grass swayed around her, and the wind carried the earthy scent of the coming rain. "William!" she called periodically, straining to hear any response over the whistling wind. When she reached the creek, Sarah followed its winding path, checking each of the small traps William had set. Most remained untouched, and there was no sign that he had been there recently. A sense of dread settled in her stomach like a cold stone. As darkness descended, Sarah was forced to acknowledge that she would need to return to the cabin. Perhaps William had circled back while she was searching, and was waiting for her there. The thought gave her a momentary flicker of hope. Her journey back was slower, the darkness making the familiar landscape strange and treacherous. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as the cabin came into view, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Sarah quickened her pace, eager to see the warm glow of a lamp in the window, a sign that William had returned. But the cabin remained dark and silent. "William!" she called as she burst through the door, her voice breaking with desperation. Only silence greeted her. Sarah lit a lamp with trembling hands, casting flickering shadows across the empty room. She placed the lamp in the window, a beacon to guide her son home, and settled into a chair to wait, her husband's rifle across her lap. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof of the cabin. Thunder rolled across the plains, and lightning illuminated the night in brief, blinding flashes. Sarah sat rigid in her chair, jumping at every sound, her eyes never leaving the door. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her hands clasped in prayer. "Bring my boy home safe." As the night wore on, exhaustion overtook her, and despite her determination to remain awake, Sarah drifted into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were filled with William's laughter, the sound of his footsteps running across the cabin floor, and the warmth of his small hand in hers. She awoke with a start at the sound of movement outside. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Sarah leapt to her feet, hope surging through her. "William," she called, rushing to the door. But it was not William who greeted her. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Standing before her were 5 Sioux warriors, their faces painted for war, their expressions impassive as they regarded her with dark, steady gazes. In that moment, Sarah knew that her life, and possibly the life of her son, had changed irrevocably. The frontier that had promised them a new beginning now threatened to become their end. The warriors moved with silent efficiency, surrounding Sarah before she could retreat back into the cabin. The leader, a tall man with a hawk feather tied in his long black hair, gestured for her to step outside. Sarah gripped the doorframe, her mind racing with stories she had heard of settler women taken captive during raids. "Please," she said, knowing they likely didn't understand her words but hoping they might comprehend the desperation in her voice. "My son is missing. Have you seen a boy? A child?" The warriors exchanged glances, and Sarah detected a subtle shift in their demeanor. The leader spoke a few words in his native tongue to one of the younger warriors, who disappeared around the side of the cabin. Sarah remained frozen in place, afraid that any sudden movement might provoke violence. The young warrior returned moments later, leading a horse. Tied to its back was William, his hands bound before him, his face streaked with dirt and tears. His eyes widened in terror when he saw his mother. "Ma!" he cried out, struggling against his bonds. "William!" Sarah started forward but was restrained by a firm hand on her arm. The leader of the warriors spoke to her in his language, his voice deep and commanding. Though she couldn't understand his words, his intent was clear. They were taking her and William as captives. With practiced movements, the warriors secured Sarah's hands with leather bindings and helped her onto a horse. The leader mounted his own steed and gave a command. As one, the small party moved away from the cabin, heading west across the open prairie. Sarah twisted in her saddle to look back at the homestead, the simple cabin she and William had worked so hard to build. Would she ever see it again? The thought brought a lump to her throat, but she swallowed it down. She needed to stay strong for William. Throughout the day, they rode at a steady pace. Sarah tried to catch William's eye to offer him reassurance, but he rode several horses ahead of her. His small shoulders slumped in defeat. The warriors maintained a vigilant watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit or danger. By mid-afternoon, they reached a shallow river. The warriors dismounted, allowing the horses to drink while they conferred among themselves. Sarah seized the opportunity to speak to William, who had been brought to the riverbank near her. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, scanning his face and body for any sign of injury. William shook his head, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I'm sorry, Ma," he said, his voice barely audible. "I went farther than I was supposed to. I saw their camp and tried to run, but they caught me." "Shh, it's not your fault," Sarah soothed, wishing she could take him in her arms. "We'll find a way out of this, I promise." Their whispered conversation was cut short as the leader approached. Up close, Sarah could see that his face bore the lines of a man in his 40s, with eyes that held a depth of experience and authority. He studied her for a moment, then spoke a few words and gestured toward the river. One of the younger warriors brought Sarah a water skin, allowing her to drink. The cool water soothed her parched throat, and she nodded her thanks. The warrior then offered water to William, who accepted it with trembling hands. The brief rest ended too soon. They mounted their horses and continued their journey, crossing the river and heading toward a line of hills visible on the horizon. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, Sarah saw smoke rising from beyond the hills, the Sioux camp. Her heart sank at the realization that they were being taken deeper into unknown territory, further from any chance of rescue. Yet a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that there had been no violence, no cruelty in their treatment thus far. Perhaps there was reason to hope. As they crested the final hill, Sarah gasped at the sight that greeted her. A large encampment spread across the valley below, dozens of teepees arranged in a circle, with horses grazing nearby and the smoke from cooking fires rising into the evening air. Women moved about the camp, preparing the evening meal, while children played and men gathered in small groups talking. Their arrival caused a stir in the camp. People emerged from teepees and gathered to watch as the returning warriors brought their captives into the circle. Sarah felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, curious, wary, some openly hostile. She straightened her back, determined not to show fear despite the terror clawing at her insides. The leader dismounted and spoke to an elderly man who approached, his bearing regal despite his advanced years. The old man wore an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers and carried a pipe adorned with beadwork and feathers. Chief Blue Thunder, the leader of this band of Sioux, listened as the warrior who had captured Sarah and William recounted their discovery. Sarah was helped down from her horse, her legs shaky after the long ride. William was brought to stand beside her, and she pressed against him protectively. The chief approached them, his gaze penetrating as he assessed the strange white woman and her son. To Sarah's surprise, the chief spoke to her in halting English. "Why you on our land?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age. Sarah swallowed hard before answering. We didn't know it was your land, sir. The government gave us papers for the homestead." The chief's expression darkened at the mention of the government. "White man's government takes what not theirs to give," he said. "This land belonged to Sioux for many generations." Sarah had no answer for that. She had never questioned the legitimacy of their claim to the homestead. The land had been legally granted to them under the Homestead Act. But standing here, facing the people who had called this place home long before white settlers arrived, she felt the first stirrings of understanding. Chief Blue Thunder gave instructions to the women of the tribe, who came forward to take charge of the captives. Sarah and William were led to a small teepee at the edge of the camp, where their bonds were removed, though a guard was posted outside. Inside they found buffalo robes for bedding and a small fire for warmth. As darkness fell outside, Sarah held William close, stroking his hair as she had when he was small. "Try to sleep," she whispered. "We need to keep our strength up." "Are they going to kill us, Ma?" William asked, his voice small and frightened in the darkness. Sarah pressed her lips to the top of his head. "No," she said with more conviction than she felt. "If that was their intention, they would have done so already. We just need to be patient and watch for an opportunity." As William's breathing eventually evened out in sleep, Sarah remained awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Sioux camp, distant singing, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft murmur of conversations in a language she couldn't understand. And beneath it all, the question that haunted her. What fate awaited them in this strange new world? Dawn broke over the Sioux encampment, painting the teepees with golden light. Sarah awoke to the sounds of the camp coming to life. Women calling to one another, children laughing, horses nickering. For a moment, disoriented from sleep, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back, and she tightened her arms around William, who still slumbered against her side. The flap of their teepee opened, and a middle-aged Sioux woman entered, carrying a wooden bowl of some kind of stew. She set it down near them and gestured for them to eat before departing without a word. Sarah gently shook William awake. "We need to eat," she said softly. "Keep up our strength." William rubbed his eyes and stared at the bowl suspiciously. "What is it?" Sarah examined the contents, a mixture of wild roots, dried berries, and what appeared to be small pieces of meat. "I'm not sure, but it smells good enough." She took a small bite and nodded encouragingly. "It's not bad. Try some." They ate in silence, both aware of the guards still stationed outside their teepee. When they had finished, Sarah set the empty bowl aside and turned to William. "Listen to me," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "We need to learn as much as we can about this place, these people. Watch everything, remember everything, and most importantly, don't do anything to anger them. Do you understand?" William nodded solemnly. "Yes, Ma." The flap opened again, and this time it was the warrior who had led their capture, the man with the hawk feather. He gestured for them to come outside. Sarah took William's hand, and they emerged into the bright morning light. The camp was a hive of activity. Women worked at various tasks, scraping hides, cooking, weaving. Children ran and played between the teepees. Men gathered in small groups, some working on weapons or tools, others talking or smoking pipes. It was a scene of ordinary domestic life that struck Sarah with its unexpected familiarity, despite the vast cultural differences. The warrior led them to the center of the camp, where Chief Blue Thunder sat before his teepee, smoking a long pipe. Several other men, presumably tribal elders or important warriors, sat in a semicircle around him. Sarah and William were brought to stand before this council, and Sarah felt William's hand tighten nervously in hers. The chief regarded them for a long moment before speaking. "You say white man's government give you our land," he said in his broken English. "You build cabin where our ancestors hunt buffalo for many generations." Sarah swallowed hard. "We meant no disrespect," she said, choosing her words carefully. "We were told the land was available for settlement. My husband died, and I needed a place to raise my son." The chief's eyes shifted to William, who stood straight back beside his mother, trying to appear brave despite his fear. "The boy's father is dead?" "Yes," Sarah replied. "2 winters ago." The chief nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something for him. He spoke at length in his native tongue to the council, occasionally gesturing toward Sarah and William. Sarah wished desperately that she could understand what was being said, what fate was being decided for them. Finally, the chief turned back to them. "You will stay. Work with women. Learn Sioux ways. Maybe then you understand what you take from us." Relief washed over Sarah. They weren't to be killed or harmed, at least not immediately. They were to be integrated into the tribe, to work alongside the Sioux women. It wasn't freedom, but it was a chance to survive, to plan, perhaps eventually to escape. "Thank you," she said, bowing her head respectfully. The chief made a dismissive gesture, and the warrior with the hawk feather led them away. As they walked through the camp, Sarah felt the curious stares of the tribe members, some hostile, others merely interested in these strange white captives. They were brought to a large teepee where several women were working on tanning hides. The warrior spoke briefly to the women, then departed, leaving Sarah and William in their care. An older woman with gray-streaked braids and a lined face approached them. "I am Morningstar," she said in surprisingly good English. "You work with us now." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You speak English well." Morningstar's expression remained impassive. "Missionaries came to our village many seasons ago. I learned their words." She pointed to a pile of hides. "You help scrape. Boy can fetch water." And so began their new life in the Sioux camp. Days turned into weeks as summer progressed across the plains. Sarah and William worked alongside the tribe's women, learning their tasks and gradually picking up words and phrases of the Sioux language. William, adaptable as children often are, seemed to absorb the language more quickly than Sarah, soon able to communicate in simple sentences with the Sioux children. Morningstar became their reluctant teacher and protector. Though never warm, she treated them fairly, and intervened when others in the tribe showed hostility. Through her, Sarah learned more about the Sioux way of life, their customs and beliefs, their deep connection to the land that white settlers were increasingly encroaching upon. "Your people build fences," Morningstar told her one day as they worked together pounding chokecherries for pemmican. "Say this land mine now, but land not for owning. Land is for all creatures. For buffalo, for wolf, for eagle, for Sioux." Sarah considered this perspective so different from the concept of property and ownership she had been raised with. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted. Morningstar gave her a long look. "That is problem with white people. Never think of other ways." The warrior with the hawk feather, whom Sarah now knew was called Swift Arrow, often observed them from a distance. He rarely spoke to them directly, but Sarah sometimes caught him watching William with an unreadable expression. She learned from Morningstar that Swift Arrow had lost his own son to a white man's disease the previous winter. One evening, as the summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the prairie, Sarah sat outside their teepee, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. William had been allowed to join some of the Sioux boys in a game, and she could hear his laughter, a sound she had feared she might never hear again, mingling with that of the other children. Swift Arrow approached and sat beside her, his presence surprising her. For a long moment they watched the sunset in silence. "Your son," he finally said in halting English. "He learned Sioux ways quick." Sarah nodded. "Children adapt easily." Swift Arrow seemed to consider this. "My son," he said, touching his chest. "He was same age. Smallpox take him last winter." Sarah's heart ached for him, this man who had been her captor but who now revealed himself as a father grieving his child. "I'm sorry," she said simply. He nodded once, accepting her sympathy. "White man bring disease. White man take our hunting grounds. Soon, nowhere for Sioux to go." Sarah had no answer for that. Since living among the Sioux, she had begun to see the settlement of the West through different eyes. The empty land that the government parceled out to homesteaders was not empty at all, but home to people with their own deep history and connection to the place. "What will happen to us?" she asked, voicing the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks. Swift Arrow was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke. "Winter soon come. We move camp to Sheltered Valley. You and Boy come too." He paused, then added, "After winter, we see." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was enough to know that they would be kept alive through the winter. Sarah thanked him, and he rose to leave, pausing only to watch William for a moment, as he played with the Sioux children, his laughter carrying across the camp in the gathering twilight. Later that night, as William slept beside her in their teepee, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in the weeks since their capture. William seemed almost at home here now, learning the Sioux language and customs with an ease that both amazed and troubled her. She worried that the longer they stayed, the harder it would be to return to their former life, if that was even possible anymore. And yet she could not deny that living among the Sioux had opened her eyes